The obese girl knocked on every door for help until the mountain man opened his. The winter of 1887 came early to Coldwater Valley, nestled deep in the Wyoming Territory, where civilization still fought for every inch against the wild frontier. Most folks in town knew Ivy McLaren by sight. She was impossible to miss, after all. At nearly 280 pounds, she cut a substantial figure as she made her rounds delivering mail along the frozen mountain trails. The postmaster had hired her 2 years prior, not out of kindness, but because no one else would take the job for such meager pay and punishing conditions. Ivy had learned long ago to let the whispers roll off her broad shoulders like winter rain off oilcloth, the children pointing and laughing when she walked by, the women clutching their husbands' arms a little tighter when she passed, as if obesity were somehow contagious. The men who called her "that big gal," with a mixture of amusement and disgust in their voices. She'd heard it all before, in every town from Missouri to Montana, since she was a child herself. What most folks in Coldwater didn't know was that Ivy had been a scholar once, back in Boston. She'd read Shakespeare and Whitman, could speak passable French, and had dreams of becoming a teacher. But when her parents died of consumption, leaving her orphaned at 16 with nothing but debt, those dreams died too. No school would hire a woman of her size to stand before impressionable children. "It sets a poor example," one headmaster had told her, not unkindly but firmly, as if her very existence were a moral failing. So she drifted west, taking whatever work she could find, washing dishes until her weight broke through a rotted floorboard and the restaurant owner dismissed her, sewing until the chair collapsed beneath her and the seamstress laughed her out of the shop. Finally, the mail route, a job that kept her mostly alone, trudging through snow and mud with a heavy sack, where her size was almost an advantage. The weight helped her stay grounded in fierce winds, and her strength meant she could carry loads that would break smaller carriers. The morning of November 28th began like any other. Ivy rose before dawn in her small rented room above the general store, the only lodging she could afford on her wages. She dressed in Layer's wool undergarments, 2 petticoats, a heavy woolen dress, a man's coat she'd bought from the trading post, and the sturdy boots she'd resoled 3 times already. The sky outside her window looked ominous, heavy with the promise of snow, but the mail had to go through. That was the job. By the time she'd collected the mailbag from the post office, the first flakes were already falling. Old Mr. Henderson, the postmaster, squinted at the darkening sky and frowned. "Might be you should wait this one out, Ivy," he said, though they both knew he didn't mean it. The circuit judge was due in town, and there were legal documents that needed delivering to the mining camp up in the high valley. "I'll be fine," Ivy replied, shouldering the heavy bag. "I've been through worse." She hadn't, though. Not really. The snow started in earnest as she left town, heading up the winding trail toward the mountains. What began as gentle flurries quickly transformed into a howling blizzard. The wind screamed through the pines, driving snow so thick she could barely see 5 feet ahead. Ivy pressed on, head down, following the trail more by memory than sight. She'd made this route dozens of times. She knew every turn, every landmark. But this storm was different. This storm was a killer. She was maybe 3 miles from town when she heard it, a small voice, barely audible over the wind, crying out. Ivy stopped, straining her ears. There it was again, a child's voice, weak and desperate. Help! Somebody help! Ivy dropped the mailbag and followed the sound off the main trail, pushing through waist-deep drifts. The voice grew stronger, more panicked. Then she saw him, a boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, trapped in a snowdrift against a fallen tree. His lips were blue, his small body shaking violently. "I got you, sweetheart," Ivy said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She dug through the snow with her bare hands, ignoring the burning cold until she could pull him free. The boy was half frozen, barely conscious. She wrapped him in her own coat and held him against her chest, using her body heat to warm him. "Where's your mama?" she asked, but the boy could only whimper. His clothes suggested he was from town, good wool, well-made boots. He must have wandered off and gotten lost in the storm. Ivy knew she had to get him to shelter fast, but returning to town meant fighting directly into the blizzard. The nearest shelter was the collection of houses that dotted the lower valley, homesteads of farming families and merchants. She turned downslope. The boy clutched tight in her arms and staggered toward the first house she could make out through the whiteout, the Johnsons' place. She'd delivered mail there before. Good people, she'd thought. She pounded on the door with her fist. Mrs. Johnson cracked it open, her eyes widening at the sight of Ivy covered in snow, holding the half-frozen child. "Please," Ivy gasped, "this boy needs warmth, just for a bit until the storm." "I can't," Mrs. Johnson said quickly, already closing the door. "Our floors, they're old. They couldn't. We just had them repaired and—" The door clicked shut. Ivy stood there, stunned, the wind tearing at her clothes. Then she understood. The floors couldn't hold her weight. That's what the woman meant. She tried the next house, the Stevensons. Mr. Stevenson didn't even open the door all the way. "Sorry, miss. Can't help you. Try the church." The church was 2 miles away, back toward town, into the teeth of the storm. The boy was getting colder, his shivering beginning to slow, a bad sign. House after house, door after door, the Millers, the O'Briens, the Hartfords, each had an excuse. The floors, the stairs, space, they couldn't possibly. "So sorry. Good luck." Ivy's strength was failing. The cold was seeping into her bones, despite her size. The boy had stopped shivering entirely now, gone limp in her arms. She'd tried 11 houses, 11 families who'd rather let them freeze than risk their precious floorboards. Her vision started to blur as she stumbled past the last house at the edge of the valley. Beyond this point, there was nothing but wilderness and the mountain itself. She fell to her knees in a drift, still clutching the boy. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was how her story ended, frozen in the snow, worthless to the very end, not even worth the space she took up. Through the swirling snow, she saw a light, not close, maybe 100 yards up the slope. A cabin she'd noticed before, but never approached. The mountain man lived there. Everyone in town spoke of him in hushed tones. He'd come to the valley 5 years ago, built his cabin with his own hands, and rarely came to town except to trade pelts for supplies. Some said he was dangerous. Others said he was just broken, a man destroyed by some tragedy back east who'd come west to disappear. Ivy had seen him once, from a distance, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at things. He'd never spoken to her, never acknowledged her existence. But that light meant warmth. That light meant life for this child. She forced herself to stand, using reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, one foot in front of the other. The cabin seemed impossibly far away, receding with each step like a mirage. She fell twice, struggling back up each time. The boy was so still now, so quiet. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she reached the cabin door. She raised her fist to knock, but her arm was so heavy. She managed 2 weak thumps before she collapsed against the door, the boy still cradled in her arms. The last thing she heard before darkness took her was the sound of a bolt being drawn back. Warmth. That was the first thing Ivy became aware of as consciousness slowly returned. Blessed, overwhelming warmth seeping into her frozen limbs. She tried to open her eyes, but they felt crusted shut. She managed a small groan. "Easy now." A man's voice, deep and rough from disuse, but not unkind. "You're safe. The boy, too." Ivy's eyes flew open. She was lying on a thick bearskin rug in front of a massive stone fireplace, a fire roaring so hot she could feel it from 6 feet away. The boy was beside her, wrapped in blankets, his chest rising and falling steadily. His cheeks had color again. She croaked. "He'll be fine. Got him warmed up just in time. You too, though it was closer than I'd like." The mountain man, it had to be him, was sitting in a rough-hewn chair near the fire, whittling a piece of wood with methodical precision. In the firelight, she could see he was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hands steady and capable. "I tried." Ivy started to sit up, but her body protested. "The houses, they wouldn't." "I know." His jaw tightened, and for a moment something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "I watched you try every door, watched them turn you away." Shame flooded through her, hot and bitter. He'd seen it all. Seen her rejected over and over, seen her crawling through the snow like a wounded animal. "The floors," she said softly. "They were worried about their floors." The mountain man's hands stilled on his whittling. He looked at her directly for the first time, and she was struck by the intelligence in his blue-gray eyes. "Their floors," he repeated, his voice flat. "This cabin's been standing for 5 years. Built every board myself. You think I don't know how to build a floor that holds?" Ivy didn't know what to say to that. She pulled herself to a sitting position, checking on the boy again. He was sleeping peacefully now, the blueness gone from his lips. "Do you know who he is?" she asked. The mountain man shook his head. "Never seen him before. Figured he's from town, but—" He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "I don't go to town much." "Why not?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Too personal, too direct. But he didn't seem offended. He just returned to his whittling, the soft scrape of the knife against wood, the only sound besides the crackling fire. "People don't much like having me around," he said finally. "Bad memories, I suppose. I remind them of things they'd rather forget." Ivy understood that feeling all too well. She settled back against the bearskin, exhaustion pulling at her. The storm still raged outside, wind howling around the cabin's sturdy walls. But inside, it was warm and safe. When was the last time she'd felt safe? As the night wore on, the mountain man kept the fire roaring, occasionally adding massive logs that sent showers of sparks up the chimney. He made her drink hot broth from a pot that seemed to always be simmering on a hook over the flames. He checked the boy regularly, adjusting his blankets, monitoring his breathing. Somewhere around midnight, when the boy was sleeping soundly and the storm showed no signs of abating, Ivy found herself talking. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the near-death experience or simply the fact that this stranger had shown her more kindness in a few hours than she'd received in years. Whatever the reason, the words came pouring out. She told him about Boston, about her parents, about the dreams that died with them. She told him about the jobs she'd lost, the chairs that had broken, the laughter that followed her everywhere. She told him about the time a shopkeeper in Kansas City had posted a sign. No dogs, no Indians, no exceptionally large persons. She told him about the minister who'd suggested her size was God's punishment for gluttony, though she ate no more than anyone else. She told him about the loneliness of being treated like a spectacle, an oddity, something less than fully human. "They look at me," she said, staring into the flames, "and all they see is my size. Like that's all I am. Like there's nothing else to me, no thoughts, no feelings, no worth. Just this body that offends them somehow." The mountain man listened without interrupting, his hands continuing their steady work on the piece of wood, which was gradually taking the shape of a small horse. When she finally fell silent, he spoke. "My wife was small," he said quietly. "Delicate," everyone said. "Looked like a strong wind might blow her away. She died giving birth to our son." He set down his whittling and stared at his large, capable hands. "Doctor said if she'd been bigger, stronger, maybe she would have survived. Maybe our son would have survived." "I'm sorry," Ivy whispered. "That was 7 years ago. I came out here to get away from the pity, the sorry for your loss every time I walked down the street. Built this cabin with my own hands, hunted my own food. Thought I'd learn to be alone." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "But you know what I learned? People will find a reason to reject anyone. Too big, too small, too broken, too whole. Doesn't matter. They'll find a reason if they want one." The boy stirred in his sleep, murmuring something that sounded like, "Mama." "Somebody's missing him," Ivy said. "Somebody should have been watching him," the mountain man replied grimly. "A boy that age, wandering alone in a storm? That's not an accident. That's neglect." They sat in companionable silence after that, watching the fire burn low and then roar back to life as more logs were added. Ivy dozed off and on, always waking to find the mountain man awake, watchful, keeping them safe from the storm's fury. Dawn came gray and cold, the storm finally beginning to blow itself out. The mountain man, whose name, Ivy learned, was James Thornton, made breakfast of venison, eggs from chickens he kept in a small coop, and bread he'd baked himself. The boy woke confused and frightened, but calmed when Ivy held him and spoke softly. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked. "Thomas," the boy said in a small voice. "Thomas Thornton." The wooden spoon James was using to stir the eggs clattered to the floor. He spun around, his face gone white. "What did you say?" "Thomas Thornton," the boy repeated, looking scared by the man's reaction. James crossed the cabin in 2 strides, dropping to his knees in front of the boy. His hand shook as he reached out, then pulled back, afraid to touch. "Tommy?" he whispered. "Tommy, is that really you?" The boy's eyes widened. He stared at James's face, recognition slowly dawning. "Papa," he breathed. "Papa." He launched himself into James's arms, both of them crying, holding each other as if they might disappear if they let go. Ivy watched with tears streaming down her own face, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of the reunion nonetheless. When they finally pulled apart, James was laughing and crying at the same time, running his hands over the boy's face as if to confirm he was real. "They told me you died," he said brokenly. "The landslide 3 years ago. They said they found your body. They buried you. I stood at your grave." "I don't remember a landslide," Tommy said, confused. "I've been living with Mr. and Mrs. Miller. They said you didn't want me anymore because I reminded you of Mama." The joy on James's face curdled into something dark and dangerous. He looked at Ivy, and she saw murder in his eyes. "The Millers," he said. "They're one of the families getting federal relief money for children orphaned in the landslide." The pieces fell into place in Ivy's mind. The Millers had claimed Tommy as their orphaned nephew, collecting government support meant for his care. They'd told the town he died, told James he died, and kept him hidden away to maintain their fraud. "We need to go to town," James said, standing up. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a coming storm. The three of them made their way down the mountain, the storm having left 3 feet of fresh snow that made the going difficult. James carried Tommy on his shoulders, and when Ivy struggled through a particularly deep drift, he simply picked her up and carried her as well, one arm around each of them, as if their combined weight was nothing. "Put me down," Ivy protested, mortified. "I'm too heavy. You'll hurt yourself." "You're fine," James said simply. "I carried deer carcasses heavier than you. Stop fussing." Something about the matter-of-fact way he said it, with no judgment or strain in his voice, made Ivy's throat tighten with emotion. The town came into view as they descended into the valley. Already people were gathered in the street, searching parties preparing to head out. When they saw James, Ivy, and Tommy, a ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Mrs. Johnson gasped, "Lord have mercy, they're alive." "We thought you'd both frozen to death," Mr. Stevenson said, looking genuinely relieved. James set Ivy and Tommy down gently, then turned to face the gathered townspeople. His voice, when he spoke, could have cut steel. "You thought we froze because you made sure we would, every one of you. This woman," he gestured to Ivy, "came to your doors, holding a dying child, begging for shelter, and every one of you turned her away." Guilty silence fell over the crowd. "We were worried about," Mrs. Johnson started. "Your floors," James finished coldly. "Yes, I know. Your floors were more important than a human life, more important than a child's life." "Now hold on." Mr. Miller pushed through the crowd, his face red. "We all feel bad about it, but there's no need to—" "Where's Tommy Thornton?" James interrupted. "The boy who died in the landslide 3 years ago? The boy you've been collecting orphan relief money for?" Mr. Miller's face went from red to white. His wife grabbed his arm, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Because I've got some interesting news," James continued, his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "He's alive, have been alive this whole time, living in your house while you told everyone he was your orphaned nephew from back east." The crowd erupted, voices raised in confusion, anger, disbelief. Mrs. Miller started crying, but they were tears of fear, not remorse. Other families who'd claimed orphans, Ivy realized, were quietly trying to slip away through the crowd. The sheriff pushed forward, a grizzled man named McCready, who'd always been fair if gruff. "That true, Miller? You been defrauding the government?" The fight went out of Mr. Miller like air from a punctured bladder. "We needed the money," he said weakly. "The farm was failing, and he was just sitting up there on his mountain, didn't even know his own son was alive, We were taking care of the boy. By telling him his father abandoned him, James's voice was deadly quiet. By making him think he was unwanted, we gave him a home, Mrs. Miller protested. We fed him, clothed him, with money meant for his care while his father grieved thinking he was dead. Sheriff McCready shook his head in disgust. You've committed fraud, child theft, and probably half a dozen other crimes I can think of. You're both under arrest. As the Millers were led away in shackles, James turned back to the crowd. But let's talk about last night, he said, because I watched from my window. I watched this woman, Ivy McLaren, in case any of you forgot her name after she delivered your mail for 2 years. I watched her try every house in this valley, watched her beg for help, watched you all decide your property was worth more than her life. You don't understand, someone called from the crowd. It's not personal, it's just what? Ivy found her own voice, stepping forward. She'd been silent through all of this, but something in her had broken or maybe healed during the long night in James's cabin. Just that I'm fat? Just that I'm an inconvenience? Just that I'm easier to let die than to help? The crowd shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her eyes. This woman saved your children, James said. Not just Tommy. How many times has she delivered medicine in a storm? How many times has she carried messages that kept your businesses running, your families connected? And when you needed the basic human decency of a warm fire, you shut your doors in her face. An older woman Ivy recognized as the widow Patterson stepped forward, tears on her weathered cheeks. You're right, she said clearly. We were wrong. I was wrong. I let my fear, my prejudice, nearly kill 2 people. Ivy, I'm sorry, truly sorry. One by one, others began to speak up. Not all of them. Some still looked resentful, defensive, but enough. Enough that Ivy felt something shift in the air, a crack in the wall of isolation she'd lived behind for so long. Mrs. Johnson approached hesitantly. My sister's boy, 6 months ago, he had the croup something fierce. You rode through that ice storm to bring the medicine from the next town. You probably saved his life. And She couldn't finish, overcome with shame. It's my job, Ivy said quietly. But it was more than that, and they all knew it. Sheriff McCready cleared his throat. Seems to me this town's been letting fear and small-mindedness guide it too long. We got a lot to make up for. He looked at Ivy. Starting with a formal apology from me, as an elected official. You're a credit to this community, Miss McLaren, and we've treated you shameful. James put his arm around Ivy's shoulders, a gesture so natural and protective it made her heart skip. She is a credit to this community. Question is, does this community deserve her? It was a challenge and a threat rolled into one, and everyone there knew it. The weeks that followed brought changes to Coldwater Valley, some subtle, some profound. The investigation into the orphan relief fraud uncovered 3 other families who'd made false claims. The money was returned, the families prosecuted. Tommy, legally reunited with his father, thrived in James's cabin on the mountain, and Ivy found herself in an unexpected position, welcomed. Mrs. Patterson invited her to tea, a genuine invitation that led to a tentative friendship. The postmaster gave her a raise and an official commendation. Children who'd once pointed and laughed now waved when she passed. It wasn't perfect. Some people's prejudices ran too deep to change, but it was better. It was a start. Through it all, James remained a constant presence. He started coming to town more often, always finding reasons to stop by when Ivy was sorting mail. He helped her repair her lodging room when the landlord proved reluctant. He brought her venison and vegetables from his garden. Tommy, who'd taken to Ivy with the pure, uncomplicated affection of a child, always came along, chattering about his adventures in the mountains. "Papa's teaching me to hunt," he announced one afternoon while Ivy sorted letters, "and to read tracks in the snow. And he's making me a real bow, not a toy one." "Is he now?" Ivy smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "Sounds like you're learning a lot." "He talks about you," Tommy said with the brutal honesty of a 7-year-old. "Says you're the bravest person he knows." Ivy's hand stilled on the mail. "That's kind of him." "He says maybe you could come to dinner. He's making stew, and I helped with the bread, but it came out kind of flat. He says I didn't need it enough." She looked up to find James standing in the doorway, a sheepish expression on his bearded face. "The boy's not subtle," he said. "No, he's not," Ivy agreed, fighting a smile. "But the invitation stands?" "It does, if you'd like." She would like. Very much. Dinner became a regular occurrence, once a week at first, then twice, then more often than not. Ivy found herself staying later and later at the cabin, helping Tommy with his reading, listening to James talk about his plans to expand his trap lines, teaching them both the folk songs her mother had taught her. It was on one such evening, with snow falling softly outside and Tommy asleep in his loft, that James finally spoke the words that had been building between them for months. "I've been alone a long time," he said, staring into the fire. "Thought I preferred it that way. Thought I didn't deserve anything else after failing Sarah, failing Tommy." "You didn't fail them," Ivy said softly. "Sometimes terrible things just happen." "Maybe." He turned to look at her, the firelight catching in his eyes. "But then you came stumbling through a blizzard, half frozen, carrying my son, the son I thought I'd lost. You gave me back my life, Ivy, my reason for living." "I was just doing what anyone would—" "No!" He cut her off gently. "You were doing what no one else would. And in the weeks since, watching you, talking with you, learning who you are beyond what people see, Ivy, I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the air between them. Ivy's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "I know I'm not much," James continued, "a hermit living in a cabin, barely civilized, with a son to raise and a past I can't change. But if you'd have me have us, I'd spend every day of my life making sure you know your worth." Ivy's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not what men want," she whispered. "I'm not delicate or graceful or—" James crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You're strong. You're brave. You're kind, even when the world's been cruel to you. You're smart and funny, and you make my son laugh. You make me laugh. You make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to hide." He squeezed her hands. "And if anyone can't see past your size to the remarkable woman you are, then they're fools. I'm not a fool, Ivy, not any more." She kissed him then, her first real kiss, and it was everything she'd imagined and nothing like it at the same time. It was real and warm and perfect. "I love you too," she said when they finally pulled apart. "I think I have since you opened your door that night." "Then marry me," James said. "Be Tommy's mother, be my wife, build a life with us here." "Yes," Ivy said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, yes, yes." They were married in the spring, when the valley was ablaze with wildflowers and the snow had retreated to the highest peaks. The whole town turned out, many of them bringing gifts and good wishes. It wasn't a fancy affair, just a simple ceremony performed by the traveling preacher in front of James's cabin, with Tommy as the ring bearer, beaming with pride. Mrs. Patterson had helped Ivy make her dress, a beautiful creation in cream-colored cotton that fit her perfectly, because they'd made it specifically for her, not tried to squeeze her into something designed for someone else. She'd woven wild flowers into her hair, and when James saw her, his eyes had gone bright with tears. "You're beautiful," he'd whispered, and she'd believed him because he made her believe it. The years that followed were good ones. James expanded the cabin, adding rooms for the children they hoped to have. Ivy continued her mail route, but now she had a home to return to each evening, a family waiting for her. Tommy grew tall and strong, never forgetting that Ivy had saved his life, treating her with a reverence that sometimes embarrassed her, but always warmed her heart. When their daughter was born 2 years later, a healthy, squalling girl they named Sarah after James's first wife Ivy held her and wept with joy. When their son arrived 18 months after that, Tommy, now 10, declared himself the best big brother in the territory. The town changed too. Not completely prejudiced that deep-rooted never fully dies, but enough. Enough that other outsiders found acceptance there. Enough that the story of the blizzard night became a cautionary tale told to children about the importance of kindness. Sometimes, on winter evenings when the snow fell soft outside their cabin, Ivy would sit by the fire with James and their children and marvel at how her life had turned out. She'd come to Coldwater Valley expecting nothing and found everything. "What are you thinking about?" James would ask, seeing the distant look in her eyes. "Just remembering," she'd say, "remembering the night I knocked on doors and only one opened." "Best night of my life," James would reply, pulling her close. "The night I got my son back and found my future." Tommy, growing into a fine young man, would sometimes add his own memories. "I remember being cold," he'd say, "so cold I thought I'd never be warm again. And then there was this lady, so big and strong, who picked me up and wouldn't let go. I remember thinking she was like a bear protecting me." "A bear?" Ivy would laugh. "A mama bear," Tommy would clarify, "the kind that fights off wolves and storms and anything else that tries to hurt her cubs." And Ivy would smile, because after a lifetime of being judged for her size, being compared to a mama bear felt like the highest compliment in the world. The mountains still loomed above their valley, still caught the winter storms and held the snow well into spring. But the cabin James had built had expanded, for their growing family stood strong against every wind, every storm. Its floors never creaked or complained under Ivy's weight, because they'd been built by a man who understood that strength came in all sizes and love in all forms. On summer evenings, they'd sit on the porch James had added, watching the sun set over the peaks. The children would play in the yard, their laughter echoing off the mountain, and Ivy, holding James's hand, would think about that desperate, freezing night when she'd knocked on every door in the valley. All those closed doors had led her to the one that opened, the one that mattered, the one that changed everything. "Thank you," she'd whisper sometimes, though James never asked what for. He knew. It was there in the way he looked at her, the way he held her, the way he built their life together with the same careful craftsmanship he'd used to build their home. The mountain man had opened his door, and in doing so, opened his heart, and Ivy, the mail carrier no one wanted to help, had found not just shelter from the storm, but shelter from a lifetime of loneliness. Their story became legend in Coldwater Valley, not the sanitized version told in proper parlors, but the real story, told around campfires and dinner tables. The story of how a town's cruelty was transformed by one man's kindness, how love could bloom in the coldest winter, how the measure of a person had nothing to do with the space they occupied and everything to do with the size of their heart. And every winter, when the first big snow fell, Ivy would stand at her window and watch the flakes drift down, remembering, not with bitterness for what came before, but with gratitude for what came after. The storm had almost killed her. Instead, it had brought her home